Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Trust and Estates Weekly. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about all the matters related to estate planning and trust and estate administration, both from the perspective of those who need to go through that process and for professionals like me who help people deal with these various issues. So unfortunately, if you saw my social media promotions and got my email, I was supposed to have a guest this morning. She wasn't able to make it. And her topic was one that I was particularly interested in engaging with her on, and that is religious aspects, religious obligations in estate planning. But you know, as many of you know, I myself am a rabbi, and so I'm going to talk about these issues anyway, because I think it is. I've never seen the topic addressed anywhere, and I think it is very relevant. You know. In both of the realms, like I said, for us who are going through the process, and for those of us as professionals who are helping people through the process. And so I've made a little list here of issues that touch on this subject of religion and estate planning, or for that matter, estate administration. And you know, gonna talk about those this morning. So. The fact of the matter is, and I've spoken about this in other shows, there are a number of issues related to the administration of probates in particular that date back to essentially biblical concepts or biblical law, what we call in Judaism halacha, which is Jewish law. And for example, according to Jewish law, the firstborn son gets a double portion of his father's estate when the father passes away, right? So if there's 3 sons, the estate, once the father dies, will be divided into 4 parts. The firstborn son will get 2 parts, and the other sons will get 1 part each, as opposed to each of them getting 1/3. Why was that the case? There's not an explanation in the Torah or the Talmud that I've been able to find. And I've been through most of the Talmudic books that deal with these kinds of business issues, but one could imagine that as the oldest son, he's taking over as sort of the patriarch of the family, and he'll have obligations that the younger sons will not have. And so because he has those greater obligations, he gets a greater share of his father's estate. That certainly sounds logical to me. And by the way, just because I came up with a logical basis doesn't mean that that's what it is. The fact of the matter is that religious law is based on how God wants us to handle things in the world, and sometimes it just comes down to this is what God wants, and as his loyal children, we do what he wants. So there isn't always what we might call a logical explanation for these things. So that's just one example of where at least Jewish law, halacha, might impact how an estate plan is done. So I'm going to go through, I think I've got 7 or 8 points here. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. And I'm not, at least today, I'm not going to get into the details on some of these things, but it's just to kind of put the bug in your ear to, especially if you're a professional, to help you be aware of these. And so if you are in a situation where you have a client raise them, you have a sense of, oh yeah, I have heard about that before, and then you can dig into it, as needs be. So first on the list, and this is typically a part of estate planning, is charitable giving, or what is called in religious circles tithing. So in Judaism, there is a requirement to give what's called Meiser. Meiser is 10% of one's income to charity, and there are various discussions about what qualifies as a charity, the poor, Torah institutions, those kind of things, and how much should you give to one category versus another. Again, I'm not going to get into those details, but in any event, and of course, what does income mean today? Many what are called posiks, which are people who decide matters of Jewish law, would say that in America, one's adjusted gross income is the equivalent to what the Bible calls income, right? So 10% of that is supposed to be given in to charity. So, and by the way, Judaism is not the only faith that requires charitable giving. Islam does. It's called zakat, and Christianity has a requirement to tithe. Hinduism also requires charitable giving. I'm led to understand, and so there may be a need in an estate plan to perform some charitable giving in order to comply with the client's religious demands, if you will. Okay, so how that plays out, how it's done, all of that, of course, will vary depending on who the client is, what the resources are, it's et cetera, et cetera. And I would hasten to add, by the way, that of course charitable giving is not something that only religious people do. It could be an aspect of any estate plan, and I would argue should be addressed as part of any estate plan, no matter what the religious leanings or not are of a client. But if you are dealing someone with a client who has profound religious attachment, so then I think there's no question that not only does it need to be addressed, but it needs to be addressed within the requirements of their faith practice, right? And that's really the key. So, for example, here in Los Angeles, we have something called the Jewish Foundation. And one of the things that it does is it essentially acts as an agent for the giving of charitable contributions on behalf of trusts and estates, et cetera, right? So not every community has such an agency. It's a private agency, I would hasten to add. But again, the mechanism and such, all of that would need to be worked out. Next are inheritance laws and religious traditions. So I did mention an aspect of Jewish laws of inheritance where the firstborn son gets a double portion of his father's estate. That would, by the way, that would conflict with the laws of testamentary succession, the secular laws of testamentary succession, where the firstborn son would not get a larger portion than any of the other children. It wouldn't even be sons, it would be children. So sons and daughters have essentially equal rights under the laws of testamentary succession, right? So if someone has religious beliefs about inheritance that they want to adhere to, whether it's requirements under Sharia, which fixes the shares of different heirs, spouses, children, parents, etc. It is crucial that documents be created, whether it's a will, whether it's trust, whatever, so that the decedent's estate is not made subject to the state's laws of descent and distribution, which almost for sure are going to be in conflict with whatever religious laws there are. Okay, so again, if you have a client who has a profound religious attachment, or if you are someone with profound religious attachments and you want your estate handled in accordance with the tenets of your faith, so it is imperative that you create an estate plan as opposed to just letting nature take its course. Okay, because nature taking its course is not going to comply with your religious values, and as well, it's unlikely that even knowing that you had such wishes, that the court would grant them after you have passed away. Okay, next is guardianship of children. So we tend to think of estate plans as being only financial matters, but indeed, there is more to an estate plan than just the financial side. There's also what happens to minor children, children under the age of 18, should that child's parents die while the child is a minor. Okay, and this is, again, one of those very difficult issues. So, God forbid that you die and leave behind minor children, and you have you follow strongly a particular religious faith. So, who is going to raise your child or children in the faith, right? And who can you trust to do so, right? Here in the United States, even among people who are closely adhering to their religious faith, there is still a very broad range of observance, let alone the even broader range of observance or non-observance among all Americans. So, how do you find someone who will raise your child within how you see fit to comply with your religious tenets? Very, very difficult situation. I know that when I was still married and my wife and I put together an estate plan, we really struggled as to who we would ask to raise our daughter, who at the time was, I believe, 14, if the two of us, should die while she was still a minor. And, we settled on a married couple that we knew and respected, and who we felt were raising good children. And, we talked to them, and they said they would, take that on. Thank goodness, at least up until now. My daughter still has two parents who are alive. But it's a very, very difficult situation with which to deal with. Okay. And the reality too is, if something is not put in place in an estate plan to ensure that your child is raised in the type of religious setting that you want, secular institutions will not, in many cases, consider that to be an issue. So they will overlook that. Okay. And so it's imperative, again, that in dealing with what happens with your children, that the proper documents be put in place and the proper people consulted and their consent received to raise your children, and with as much assurance as we can get that they will, follow your wishes. Okay, so that's another important aspect of religious obligations in estate planning. So, Next, there are issues of business succession and compliance with religious values. So, if part of your estate includes a business, okay, and you've been operating that business in compliance with your religious principles, okay, so for example, both Judaism and Islam do not permit the charging of interest to members of their faith. So Jews cannot charge Jews interest if they loan them money. Muslims cannot charge their fellow Muslims interest for lending or for lending them money, right? So if you have some sort of lending business, okay, and as a part of your business you do not charge your co-religionists interest, okay, how is that policy going to be maintained after you pass away? Okay, here's another one. So among Jews who keep a traditional Sabbath, they are not permitted to receive the profits of that business if it operates on a Saturday. So I'll give you an example of something that I looked into a number of years ago. Let's say that you own a bunch of vending machines, right? Well, vending machines just operate whenever somebody uses them. So if someone buys something from the vending machine on a Saturday, okay, if you are a Sabbath observant Jew, you are not permitted to receive that profit. So what do? Right? So there are mechanisms that are put into place for understanding how much that profit may be and who will get it. Okay. The business may have to have a mechanism where every Friday night at sundown, it's sold to a non-Jew, and every Saturday night at sundown, it's sold back to its Sabbath observant Jewish owner, right? And so for that 25-hour period, a non-Jewish person owns the business, and then it's a matter of being able to calculate what the profit is from the business during those 25 hours, and then that money is given to the non-Jew, right? That would be a business that's structured to comply with halacha, with Jewish law, right? So what's going to happen to that business and that practice when the owner dies? Is that practice going to continue to be carried on? Well, the answer is it'll be up to whoever is administrating that business owner's estate. And if the requirement is not documented properly to have that practice carried on, there's a good chance that it won't be. Okay. And so again, this is why in your estate plan, if that were an issue for you, or any similar the adherence to of any similar religious value is important to you, it needs to be part of the business succession plan. Okay, so like again, there's any number of issues like this, and so look, there are ethical concerns as well. This kind of dovetails with business succession, but for example, Islam does not permit the consumption of alcoholic beverages. So if a Muslim owned a retail business and it didn't sell alcohol in compliance with Sharia, okay, what's going to happen to that business when the owner dies, right? If maybe it's taken over by or maybe the members of his family that are going to inherit the business, they are not interested in a strict compliance with Sharia. So are they going to be permitted to sell alcohol now? Now the decedent may take the position, look, I'm dead and gone, I don't care. On the other hand, he may feel that as part of his legacy, he wants the business to continue Sharia compliant. And so then how will the business succession plan be set up to comply with this ethical concern or this religious concern on the part of the Muslim founder, right? So all of these things are important. Here's another one. For a Jewish business, let's say it was a Jewish market, okay, that only sold kosher food. So are they going to sell non-kosher food afterwards? Are they going to sell pork? Are they going to serve, shellfish? Not serve. Are they going to sell pork? Are they going to sell shellfish? And if not, what are the rules that are going to be kept in place, and how are they going to be kept in place in order that that kosher market remains kosher, right? So these are all questions that need to be addressed within the larger estate plan, and in this case specifically with a business succession plan. Okay. Next are end of life medical decisions. So in many faiths, the withdrawal of life sustaining treatments would not be prohibited. Would not be permitted. I should say they're prohibited. Euthanasia, prohibited. Okay, organ donation, prohibited. Right, and so when living wills or medical directives are being created for the estate plan. And again, these are the non-financial parts of an estate plan. I'm sorry, not living wills. I didn't mean that. I mean, power of attorney for healthcare and other healthcare directives. When these are being drawn up, are they going to be drawn up in accordance with the religious principles of the person who's creating the estate plan? And who is going to be appointed to decide whether any particular decision that needs to be made does comport with those religious decisions? Okay, so in Judaism, in traditional Judaism, to be specific, one typically looks to one's rabbi to give advice on whether a particular action does or does not comply with halacha. So is that person going to be the decisor in some sort of medical directive that then the relatives of the person who's ill would look to get that advice? Or is it going to be somebody else? Okay. If your rabbi is a lot older than you may not want to appoint someone who's likely to predecease you to be the person giving advice in those situations, right? So you may need to find somebody else. Okay. Now, so there are also other types of sort of advanced directives that one may want to make in order to comply with religious principles. So, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses, they may reject a blood transfusion. Okay, I know when I was a Boy Scout, we had a couple of scouts in our troop who were, I believe, Christian Scientists. And we were told that if one of them got hurt, we were not allowed to render first aid to them. The one brother could only render it to the other, and vice versa, because of their religious principles. So, I didn't think a whole lot of it back then. I was whatever I was, 11, 12 years old. And if that was the way it was going to be, that was the way it was going to be, right? Now as an older guy who helps people with these kinds of issues. So how are these things going to be dealt with? Again, who is going to be giving advice as to whether a particular treatment conforms to religious practices or not? So all of these issues need to be dealt with. Decisions need to be made about them, and they need to be put into paperwork that's properly executed in order for these proceedings to be binding on the people involved with the situation. Okay. Otherwise, if there's no medical directives, doctors are going to do what they think is best from a medical standpoint, and they're not going to take into account the religious beliefs of the person. And indeed, they may not be able to, because there may be legal issues of legal liability with which their hospital is telling them they have to comply, and that may preclude compliance with a religious principle. So, for example, a hospital may demand that a blood transfusion be done because that is standard medical procedure, even though the patient is a Jehovah's Witness and for religious reasons would reject it. But there's nothing in writing. There's nothing that requires the hospital to comply with the patient's religious principles. And so now you have this conflict, and without anything in writing, the relatives of the person at best could potentially go to court and ask for the judge to issue an injunction against the transfusion before with the hopes that the judge would do so before the transfusion was performed, right? And so that's really leaving open to chance whether the patient's religious principles will be adhered to. So this is why these issues become so important. And then finally, there are funeral and burial preferences. So I remember when I was stationed in Okinawa, Japan, I had someone who came to my classes quite often who initially was a Roman Catholic, and then she converted to Orthodox Christianity. And we were talking about end-of-life decisions. And so she had decided that after she died, she wanted to be cremated. Okay, fine. And the question I asked her was, she was still a Roman Catholic at the time. I said, does Roman Catholicism permit cremation after death? Because traditional Judaism does not. Okay, so in traditional Judaism, the deceased has to be buried in a plain wooden casket in the ground in compliance with ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So cremation is the complete destruction not only of the body but of the soul, and that's prohibited by halacha. So we had a conversation about that, and to be honest, I don't remember what she told me. I think she told me that indeed Roman Catholicism did not permit cremation, but she didn't care because she wanted to be cremated. She thought that was a better thing than taking up ground for in order to be buried. So. And that's fine. Look, whatever her beliefs are her beliefs. It was just a discussion between two people, exploring their faiths, if you will. But had she felt differently about it, where she didn't want to be cremated, and perhaps her husband and son felt like, well, after she's gone, she should be, right? That could have potentially been a problem. Or maybe, I mean, in her case, neither her son nor her husband were as religious as she was, so it wouldn't have been a conflict for them for her to be cremated. But if they had been more religious than her and did not want to see her cremated, but nonetheless she wanted to be cremated, so without some sort of written directive, it's unlikely that that her wishes would have been complied with. So these are the kinds of when it comes to burial and funeral procedures or preferences, all of this needs to be thought out in advance. So, and I'm just reading here on my notes something that I looked up. So, in Hinduism, by contrast with Judaism, requires cremation, right? So, so again, if that's, but I suspect that it has to be done in a particularly ritualistic way, right? So if someone is a devout Hindu living here in the United States, they would be well advised to make sure that their preferences for funeral and burial are put into paper and put onto paper and properly executed so that they are so that those wishes are complied with after they pass away, right? This goes beyond buying a funeral plot or paying for this kind of casket or that. These really get down to how funerals are conducted. For example, in my own faith tradition, Judaism, from the time someone dies until they're buried, by tradition, the body is not supposed to be left alone. So you have something called the Chevra Kadisha. It's essentially means the holy society. It's a group of men and women who sit with the body between the time that the person dies and is buried, and typically they read psalms in praise of the deceased soul, and they do this voluntarily, as an adherent to the religion, right? So, is that something that you definitely want if you're a traditionally religious Jew, or is that something you don't care about, right? So, all of this needs to be dealt with. Now, you may want to comply with your religious principles with respect to any of these issues that I've raised, and yet you may not exactly know what they are. Maybe you've never confronted these issues. And so, there's no time like the present to get educated on what the uh, religious demands are in the estate planning arena. And that would be a good, if you are concerned about this, but you're not really sure, what do I need to do or not do? So the first thing to do would be to learn about them. So I know in Judaism, there are a number of books on the subject. Maurice Lamb's book comes to mind because I know I read that when my father passed away. There are other books, and I assume with other religious faiths there are books on the subject as well. So I would encourage you to get one of those books and read it, to reach out to people of your faith who are knowledgeable about these topics and find out, what are your obligations religiously in this, large realm of estate planning, and then have the discussions. If you're a single person, you may not have to have the discussions with anybody other than yourself, an internal discussion. If you're married, probably it's a discussion you need to have with your spouse. And if you have children, especially children who are, I should say in particular, with children who are old enough to be consulted on these issues, have the conversations with your children as well. So there is nothing like planning for the future. And I know I've said this before, man plans, God laughs. This maybe is a particularly apt time to remember that particular saying. But in this case, the reality is, if you do not plan and get your plan into writing, it is unlikely that your wishes will be carried out in the face of the secular nature of American society. So I encourage you to look into these and make sure that as well as you can, that your wishes will be carried out. So that's the message I bring to you today. I'm sorry my guest couldn't make it. Well, hopefully I'll be able to rebook her for another time. We'll go into some of these topics in more depth. But in the meantime, we've gotten a start on this important issue. So if you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, my links to my social media will be in the show notes after this episode posts on my YouTube channel. So please feel free My email address will be there as well if there's something private you want to contact me about. Now, as I noted at the beginning, I am a rabbi. However, I am not a posek. I do not make halachic decisions for other people. So you can send me your questions on halacha, but I'm not qualified to answer them specific to your situation, but I will do my best to help you find someone who can. And I think that's all we've got for this topic. So tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time, Tuesday, is my show, Business Lessons from the Military. And I'm going to be talking about business lessons that can be learned from the great Sir Winston Churchill. Most of us think of Churchill during his time as Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II. Churchill had a military career before that, and we're going to focus on that and see what we can learn from one of the greatest individuals from the 20th century. And then on Wednesday at 10 a.m. is my show, People Making Money. And I'm going to be talking about a book called The Art of Negotiating. This is a skill that if we are in, whether we're in business or professional practice, we need to be continuously developing this skill. And so this is a wonderful book. It's actually been around for quite a long time. It's really a classic. And if you've seen my shows before, you know I love classics. So I do invite you to tune in on Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So thank you so much for joining me today, especially my live viewers. Always a treat to have you on board. And signing off as I always do, Marie, darling, you are my bell. Courage at all.